Hello. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. Sorry you had that momentary little countdown that showed up if you're watching this on the video stream. And if you're on the audio stream, sorry for the delay that you inevitably heard where you wondered what's going on. I am Doug, and I'm joined here today by Kyle. We have an empty seat in the middle of between us because Blake is not able to be here this week, but we are going to do our best to answer your questions. I'm not promising an adventure, just promising we will respond to some of the questions that you've sent in. Are you feeling like you want to raise the bar on that, Kyle?
No, I was just going to make a joke in Blake's absence that he's up training for a self-defense thing, I believe, and I can't help but try to make a joke about that some way of like he's just sitting here between us fighting and just needs to work on protecting himself and be ready for us. I don't know.
You think we're the reason for that?
Maybe.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding.
Okay,
but it's fun to toss him under the bus one more time in his absence.
It always is, and I think there's probably a good chance that'll happen again before we're done here today. Because it normally happens more than once whenever he's absent.
It's true.
So,
but speaking of self-defense, we've got a first question.
That is an excellent segue, Kyle.
Is murder sin? If so, why?
Yes.
Done. Nice and easy.
Yes. That was really...
I wish we could actually just help ourselves and just make all these questions that easy, but I want to go so much deeper on this one. There are a good number of mentions that we would point to for the beginning of this conversation. You've got your Exodus and Deuteronomy listings of the Ten Commandments. You've got other places in the Old Testament that speak negatively of murder. You've got in the New Testament a number of Paul's lists, especially, that list murderers as the group of sinners that will not inherit the kingdom of God. You've got Revelation that also mentions the same. There are a good number of references towards murder as being sin. But the why, as you've placed here, I would say is just as achievable without any of those passages, basing its foundation on the whole canon of Scripture. And that would all base right from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, where humans are made in the image of God. And the reverence that should be put towards that is, I think, the foundational reason why all of the verses aim to be true. That the idea of murder is defaming and disgracing the image of God that is inherent within human character, and therefore murder would be sin even if it weren't mentioned in any of those passages because of the image of God born by humans. And that is the why behind it, even if we didn't have any of those verses.
So I'm trying to get into the mind of the person who submitted this question.
Yes.
And we don't know who submitted this question.
Yep.
But it's an interesting question in that it's so short. Sometimes people send in very long questions. This one is only 6 words.
Yep.
Literally, you read the whole question.
Yep.
Is murder sin? If so, why? And I would guess, if I was just speculating, that the vast majority of our listeners / viewers, if they watch on YouTube, are not currently murdering people.
Probably.
And would probably have a dim view of murder.
Yep.
And so I'm trying to understand, and I haven't got any kind of understanding of why. So I'm just trying to understand the thought and the why behind this.
Yeah.
And it's intriguing to me because I don't know. So I think that it always comes back to one of the things we need to do, and I think this is not just something for this question, and it's something that I hope we aim to do well on this podcast, is define words. And I think oftentimes part of the problem why you end up having conflict among people with different points of view is because nobody ever takes time to articulate the definition of what they mean. So if I'm using a word in a context and you're using that same word with a different understanding of how I'm defining the word, though we may understand the context similarly, because we're defining it differently, we're going to have an argument. And that's going to always lead to trouble. So one of the things that I think is worth maybe taking a minute to do is talking about sin.
Yep.
And what sin is. Because the reality is, and I can't remember if we did this a little while ago or not, but I've been pondering this a lot over the last, we'll say, a couple of years. One of the challenges we have is that the Bible doesn't give us a definition of sin.
Correct.
And the Bible's not a theological dictionary. There are theological dictionaries that you can buy that offer definitions for all the theological words.
Yeah.
I know because I had to buy one when I was in Bible college. It's probably still over here on this bookshelf somewhere that's just out of camera shot.
Yeah.
But I think that it would be a valuable thing to talk about what is sin. And I think most of the time when you ask Christians that, they give you examples of sin.
Correct.
They don't give you a definition of sin.
Yep.
And maybe that's not just Christians, and maybe that's not just theological terms, because the act of defining something can be very hard. I remember, I don't know, so I know we have listeners who are across a they span a long distance geographically.
Yes.
So not all of them are familiar with Calgary,
Yep.
which we are right near.
Yep.
And Kyle, you would be aware, as I'm sure anybody who lives in the Calgary area, of the blue ring light post that is
Famous blue ring.
the famous blue ring light post
Infamous blue ring, I should say.
that is off of Airport Trail.
Yep.
Visible from Deerfoot Trail.
Yep.
So a lot of people pass this blue ring regularly.
Yep.
And it was an art piece that was commissioned.
Air quotes on art.
No, hang on. I'm going somewhere with this. It was an art piece that was commissioned by the city when
Yep.
they were doing Airport Trail to the west. So it might not be Airport Trail to the west. It might only be Airport Trail if you turn east. If you turn west, I think it's 96th Ave or something like that. In any case, whether you know the road name or not, you know the blue ring if you've seen the blue ring.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people who were not happy with, is it or isn't it art?
Yep.
You know, what is this? Like the city spent all this money, because it was a large amount of money that was spent on this blue ring.
Like over $1 million.
I believe it was over $1 million, yes.
Yeah.
So I went, one day I was like, okay, what is art?
Yep.
Because we can all talk about art,
Yep.
and yet who can define art?
Yep.
Right? So if I said to you, Kyle, what is art? You would probably, and I think most of us would, give examples rather than definition.
Yep.
So I went to the dictionary and I looked up the definition of art.
Right.
And the definition of art is the use of skill and imagination to create something that provokes a response.
That's cool. I like that.
To which I said, that clearly is art because it's provoked a response. It's
Not a positive one necessarily.
It didn't say a positive response.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
It just said to provoke a response.
Yeah.
So by the dictionary definition of art,
Yep.
we have art there.
Yep.
There was some skill involved. There was some imagination involved. Someone said to an artist, do something to create like a unique streetlight here.
Yep.
And they decided that's what they were going to do.
Yep.
I say all of that to just talk about, we don't think about definitions well. We typically will, instead of definitions, give examples to help someone understand.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's a level where to help understand you do that. You put something that is known alongside something that is unknown to help people understand the unknown thing. That's what Jesus did with parables.
Yeah.
That is literally like all the parables. And I believe that is even the origins of the word parable is like to cast alongside the idea that you take this known thing, you cast it alongside this unknown thing so people get an idea of the unknown.
Makes sense.
Nothing wrong with that. But if we're gonna really understand and we're gonna really talk about sin, then I think we have to have a definition of sin.
Yep.
And the problem is, if you ever, you have kids,
Yep.
and so you've had this, and maybe not all of our listeners have, and I want to respect that, but at some point your kids ask you, what is fill in the blank?
Yep.
And you have to explain it to them.
Yep.
And more often than not, your first thought is stumbling for words. Like you're stumped, and you're like, how do I explain this thing? So I say all of that to say, and to challenge our listeners, do you have a definition of sin? Which I think is an important thing if we are people who are told to avoid sin, and that sin kills, and that the wages of sin is death. Clearly, it's something we need to not engage in. So what is it? And we can look in the New Testament. In the New Testament, there are, I want to say, 8 lists. I've compiled them all into a spreadsheet so I can look and review them, of different examples of sins. And depending on how you combine some of the different words, because there is some overlap on some of the words, there's a low 50 number of examples of sins among those 8 lists. But a definition of sin, as I've sat and I've thought about it and I've pondered and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what is sin, and you could say it's missing the mark, which, sure, that's great. But then what is the mark?
Correct.
So you've provided an answer that maybe gets some clarity, but hasn't provided like the hitting the bullseye of what it is. For me, where I've settled on with sin, and this is my loose working definition. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying it's done. But I'm saying it's kind of where I am right now. If you look at all of the lists of sins in the New Testament, they really boil down to me allowing something to have too much of a place in my life. There's excess there. Or me in some way exploiting or abusing or defaming or defacing or defiling the image of God in another person. That all of the sin boils down to really those two things.
Right.
And so for me, as I'm sitting, this is where I've kind of come to lately, is that sin is this one of two things. It is either me doing something that defaces or defiles the image of God in another human being,
Right.
or me doing something that defaces or defiles the image of God in myself.
Okay.
Put another way, if we take Jesus' greatest commandment, love God, love your neighbor as yourself, sin is any time that I'm not loving my neighbor as myself,
Yep.
or engaging in some activity that will eventually prevent me from loving my neighbor as myself. So all of those sins of excess, because we could say, well, like drunkenness is a sin. But if I'm sitting in my home by myself,
Yep.
getting drunk, that doesn't affect my neighbor at all,
Yep.
right? Well, no, but if you continually give yourself to drunkenness, it will eventually impede your ability to love.
Sure. Yeah.
So if we look at those as kind of some possible definitions of sin,
Yep.
then you would say murder is sin.
Yep.
Because I can't murder you without defiling the image of God in you and not honoring that.
Yep. I leaned towards N.T. Wright's work, and I was scrambling quickly through my Kindle app here to see if I could get the quote. I got close, but couldn't quite find the exact one. But in his The Day the Revolution Began, he talks about sin as a vocational issue, not necessarily. That then leads to the moral and ethical implications of sin, but it is foundationally a vocational issue, that humans were created to worship and glorify God and be in relationship with one another. And that is our role, which lines up very similar to what you're talking.
Yep.
And anything that then cheapens or gets in the way of that vocation, of us being able to do that to its fullest capacity, to relate to one another and to glorify God, that is sin. And anything that shortcuts that. And so we then are missing the mark, and the mark is who we are to be and what we are to do, and that is applied both individually and corporately. So Israel vocationally was supposed to be a nation of priests. So anything that Israel did that got in the way to be priests as a corporate entity was just as much a corporate sin as anything that we individually do to keep ourselves individually or keeping somebody else from doing that. So I've always really enjoyed his vocational identity and definition of what sin is towards that. So not in any contrast to you, but just in...
I think it's just looking at it from a different angle.
Totally. Yeah. So I just really like that simplifying. And so, yeah, murder in turn is one, I think, obviously to get the point of murder, there's been something done in my heart that is keeping me from my attention on God and glorifying him. And two, then keeping the other person by killing them from being able to glorify God and participate in that. And obviously the relationship between those two people is harmful or is harmed. And so I would say that is going to be sin there. Now, we could really belabor this question by talking about the idea of what murder is in comparison to are there places where that is justified, like war, and those kind of ideas within the Christian context. So is there a separation of murder and justified killing, as some would draw the line in our view?
And that's a whole different question that
Maybe
we could get into. Well,
and that's, looking at, even though this is a 6-word question, the width of room for this. So I personally, I'm really partially asking this question to see if we just want to go down the rabbit trail. I would lean towards a Christian would still be sinning even in a seemingly justified war case to be the one behind pulling the trigger against another image bearer of God.
So are you saying, when you say that there's a different definition of sin for Christians than for non-Christians?
No. But when you are conscious of what it means to vocationally be worshiping God and in relationship with one another, and you're intending to not sin, and you're intending to follow that, you then should be that much more conscious of participation in such a thing as a Christian. And
so you began that answer to my question with a no, but then seemed to ultimately say yes.
No, so
sorry, I'm not trying to pick on you.
No.
You said
So
no, but
I would have the exact same definition for sin in all other categories for non-Christians, but they're not conscious of it. So a Christian idolizing money or fame, or a non-Christian idolizing money or fame, is just following a natural American dream trajectory that they are doing. But I would still look at that as sinful in their life, whether they realize it or not. But to the Christian who says, I want to follow and participate in the kingdom of God and his vocation for me as an image bearer of himself, I would have then questioned and pastor somebody away from such ends when they are getting in the way of that vocation, because they are conscious and aiming to not be participating in sinful patterns. So those are both, yes, sinful. I don't have a voice to the person who's not following God. So for a Christian to get behind a weapon of some sort with a war army of some sort, I would still say that is murder and therefore is still sinful, even under the justified war cause that some Christians will argue for and support.
I guess I would, and this is where things get messy, right?
Of course,
because if you go to remove from that, and this is where, I mean, if you listen to some different Bible scholars, they talk about this idea of murder in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew Bible is really illegal killing, because there is sanctioned killing, and if you read through it, if someone kills your family member and you're the kinsman redeemer, you can go kill that person, and it's not considered murder because it's not illegal murder because it's allowed by law. And I recognize we're looking at an Old Testament version and a Hebrew Bible that we have to look at through the lens of Jesus. I'm not debating that at all. But if you, instead of going to the war analogy, I would go to, well, this has happened far too many times, a school shooting. Someone's in a school shooting and they're shooting a bunch of innocent people, or in a mall or somewhere else, and a police officer shoots that person to prevent it. Have they sinned?
I would say yes. But the decision that, I'll jump again, I've just been recently re-exposed to the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He very much recognized, but him participating in an effort to kill Hitler, he was stuck between which of two sins was he going to commit.
Yes.
And so he recognized that was going to be sin, but he was still willing to participate in that for what he saw as a decent end. But he would never try to claim, I don't think, from what I have read, that was not a sinful thing he was aiming towards. But it was in this brokenness of this world, which sinful end will I participate in? So there is a different language there than somebody who is saying this is justified killing, therefore it can't be sin. Then because of the brokenness of this world, I must participate in some sin. That's
and this is where it gets messy, and this is where I don't I'm like, man, I don't. I was in Bible college when the professor was like, so if you're one of the people hiding Jews in your attic during World War II, and the Nazis come and they ask you, do you have Jews in your house? And you say no,
Yep.
Like, did you sin? And everyone's like, well, it's fine. And he's
Yep.
like, is it though? And he wasn't trying to provoke, but he was trying to get us to think on a deeper level and to realize
Totally.
that oftentimes there is no clear, easy answer
Yep.
as much as we want them.
Yep.
Right? The reality is that we live in a messy world, and at the end of the day, love is the path we need to. So for me, when I look at this question, I can't help but go to the Sermon on the Mount.
Yep.
Jesus says, "You have heard it said,
Yep.
do not kill. But I say to you,"
Yep.
and it's fresh in my mind because I've been listening to the Bema podcast on Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, yeah.
And their episode on this one was so good.
Yeah. Bible Project or
Sorry,
Bema?
Bible Project.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bible Project. Did I say Bema?
Yeah.
Sorry, Bible Project. Because Jesus says, Matthew 5:21, "You have heard it said, you've heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell." And what they point out is you have this de-escalating series of things that the person is doing,
Yep.
with an escalating series of consequences.
Yep.
So, if you're murder, you're subject to judgment. If you're angry, you're subject to judgment. If you call your brother or sister Raka, which means like you good for nothing, like that's not like, oh, you're such a dummy.
No.
Like that's a big deal. You're answerable to the court.
Yeah.
And anyone who says, now what version am I reading here? What is this? It's the NIV, which, okay, it isn't bad, but it'll get to the point. And then if you say, you fool, which isn't as big of an insult as Raka
Yeah.
2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
you're in danger of the fire of hell.
Yeah.
And they just talk about how, and this to me, like, just got me thinking about this whole idea of sin.
Yeah.
And how we're so quick to have our list of sins
Yeah.
that we're like, okay, I've avoided these, therefore I'm holy.
We're good.
But this whole section of the Sermon on the Mount that talks about murder, that talks about adultery, and that talks about divorce. Are those the three that he talks about? Yeah, those three: murder, adultery, and divorce are really Jesus calling you to rethink.
Yep.
Great, you didn't murder anyone.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep.
So you think you haven't sinned?
Yep.
Have you ever called anyone a fool?
Yeah.
Because and when they get into it, just the whole unpacking that they do
It's beautiful.
of that section,
Yep.
and the reality of the call of Jesus and the holiness that we are called to, and the life that we're called to, and the not even allowing anything to even be like the smallest speck of root of wrongness in our life is dangerous. And that's the message of Jesus. It's not that he's just setting up a new rule book.
Yep.
And they talk over and over, and I really appreciated how they talked over and over about this is Jesus showing the Old Testament as wisdom literature.
Yeah.
That the people in Jesus' day were like, okay, don't murder. Check. And Jesus' point is, you are missing the boat of why that is there in the Ten Commandments. It's not in the Ten Commandments so you don't kill someone. It's wisdom literature so you would reflect on it and ponder it. And why is it that I'm not allowed to murder? Okay, so if I'm then in a place where I'm now wishing you bad intent, I'm on the road to murder. And that's a bad thing, and I need to avoid it.
Totally. It puts a lot more weight on our day to day, and I think it ties really closely to when Jesus interacts with the rich and young ruler. Like, I've done the list. I got it. What more do I need? And he tells him, you have to go sell everything. And he walks away with that, what's the word, heavy heart? Or
great
something along
sorrow.
those- Great sorrow.
Depending on the
Of
translation.
That is, I think, something that can be experienced, and maybe sorrow is not the right word, but like a heaviness and a conviction that I've experienced more and more as I come to recognize what Jesus is truly calling me to. I've used this analogy a few times, but when I was 16, 17, 18, I thought, if I could just stop lying, I'll basically be right next to Jesus in my sinlessness. That was my big struggle. Or if I could, whatever, name the list. Stop looking at bad things on the internet. You name it. And we'll get these 3 things out of my life and I'll be set. Versus the deep call to a pure heart
Yes.
that Jesus calls us to is so much different. And it can leave us like, oh, well, I'm never going to get there. Correct. You've got a whole lifetime to work towards it. And yet there's a deep invitation there of it's more than just the list. The who are we are being called to be instead of what we are called to not do is a very different thing. But I think we've been offered a cheap idea in many churches. And so is murder sin? Yes. Why? Because there's a deep, rich call that Jesus has called us to in participation of his creation that goes beyond a few verses in our text.
Well, and I think that if you to realize that what Jesus would say is if you've reached the point where you've murdered someone, the problem started way before
Absolutely
you actually did the deed.
Yep.
And so avoid that thing because you have a responsibility to your brother or sister to not murder them, to never wish them ill intent.
Yep.
But going back to the story of the rich young ruler, I was pondering that story Monday morning, just reflecting on that story, thinking about we take that story and we turn it into a new rule.
Yeah.
Okay, well then I gotta
sell all the things.
I don't really have to sell them because we don't say that. Instead, I have to just recognize that they're all Jesus's.
Yeah.
But Jesus never said that to anyone else.
No.
The problem is not money.
Yeah.
The problem in that story was his relationship with money. And so the question that I think the gospel writers want us to wrestle with when we read that story is, what is my one thing that we lack? Jesus says, one thing you lack. And then he puts his finger for him. What is that one thing? Well, when Jesus looks at us, he doesn't be like, therefore don't love money. But he says to us, what is your one thing? And so for some people, they're exceedingly generous. And they're like, whoa, I'm next to Jesus, like you if you just stopped lying, right? Then, okay, mission accomplished, I'm done. Instead of recognizing, for someone else, my one thing may be control or comfort or security or sex or food or who knows whatever, the respect and admiration or love of an individual. That may be my one thing that is the thing that I refuse to surrender to God.
Yeah.
Whatever that one thing is, God asks for it. Not because he's cruel, but because he knows that in him is life, and anything we're clinging to and looking for life in somewhere else is ultimately going to bring death.
Yep.
So in our chasing life, we end up finding death. But if we would trust Jesus enough to die to self and to chase death, we would find life.
Yep.
This is the message of Jesus.
Yep. Absolutely.
I feel like that six-word question got a lot of answer.
Yeah, there you go. So, reminder there, if you've got any further questions or clarification or accusations, send it in on invertedorthodoxy.com.
If someone's like, seriously, murder's not sin? I'm going to be like,
InvertedOrthodoxy.com. It's all over the place there. You can send it in, label it AER, just mention on last week's podcast, something like that, and we will continue to talk about it further.
All right, let me shoot one your way, Kyle.
Sure.
And this one we did touch on last week in our AER, but I think that there's some good points to this one.
Yep.
The question is a multi-point one, and it's more than 6 words long. How does Living Springs Church disciple people? What is the process? Where does it start? How does it continue? What is the aim?
Awesome question. Let me end with the end. What is the aim? Or begin with the end? To image Jesus more fully by becoming love, both individually and corporately.
Yes.
That is the aim. And it is an aim that I will fully admit is always able to be expanded and known more. So none of us in our lifetime will ever fully accomplish it individually or corporately, because there is always more room for us to image Jesus more clearly. So we'll never get there. Then with mentioning again, this was discussed last week, and we talked about a number of ways that we are aiming to do better at this and add some short-term programs and groups. Like that is still going to come. But just as the question was read again today, and maybe coming off of we as a staff are reading a Eugene Peterson book, The Pastor, I might add some different angles and perspectives on this. I started last week talking about how we preach from the story that God has been participating in the world, and that has, for the most of Christian history, been sufficient for discipling. And I still agree with that. But let me say this, is that we at Living Springs are intentional about how we spend our time with our congregation, pastoring our people. And so we don't aim necessarily for one large program to be universally applicable to people. We spend, each one of us, I would bet you, at least 30 to 50% of most of our weeks meeting with people in our congregation. And that isn't just within our 9 to 5 hours. That is after hours with texts and phone calls and all those things, where we are meeting with our people to the best of our ability for 5 pastors, not even all of us full time, walking with people in our church to become more like Jesus and to find him in their lives. And so I want to give a lot of credit first to that. We do that by being, I think, closest as we can, close to the real definition of pastor. We are not program leaders. We are aiming to be pastors and shepherds to the particular people that God has entrusted us with in this congregation. And so first and foremost, and most importantly, we pastor people individually by walking alongside them is something I want to emphasize.
Yeah. I don't want to minimize the need for process and program.
Yep.
But I want to also say discipleship cannot just be a process, and it cannot just be a program.
No. And we emphasized a lot of that last week too.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I think it bears repeating.
Yep,
Because
for sure.
discipleship has become a program in a church.
Yep.
In the church. In the 21st century,
Yep.
that is what we think of discipleship as. We think of discipleship as a course I take,
Yep.
a program I participate in, information I gain.
Yep.
Discipleship is relationship.
Yep.
I had a youth parents meeting last week or the week before.
Last week, yeah.
And at it, one of the things I talked about was that my hope and my goal and my dream as I work with the youth of our church is to help them take the next step in their faith. And I said, my dream is that they get past their Sunday school faith. Yeah. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Sunday school faith.
No.
That's a wonderful foundation. That the things you learn in Sunday school are a great starting point. But if we never get past that,
Yep.
if we never start to think deeper, if we never start to reflect further, then we never get past that. And then we end up being adults who are still holding on to the first thing we learned. And not that we let go of the first thing we learned, but we build on the first thing we learned.
Yep.
And we think we've got it all. And then I said to the parents, that's my goal. And then I said, And along with that, to that end, I said, my heart is to help you in the discipling you've been doing of your kids.
Yep.
Because you have been discipling your kids for their entire lives. And this is the part I think we don't understand, is that discipleship is always happening.
Yes.
If you're a parent and you have kids, you are discipling them. And you're discipling them every day.
Yep.
In the choices you make, in the things you talk about, in the what you watch, in how you interact with others, in how you treat the server in a restaurant, in all of these things. You are discipling your kids all the time.
Yep.
And that is discipleship.
Yep.
And so when I think about discipleship in a church context, I'm like, yes, and I'm not minimizing long-form teaching nights, and I'm not minimizing groups, and I'm not minimizing all the ways that we try to offer our church where they can gain knowledge, where they can grow in their faith, where they can deepen their understanding of God, and God is revealed in Jesus and found in Scripture. Not minimizing any of that. I just want to say, if we don't understand what discipleship really is, we're going to miss the point that we are always discipling, and we're always being discipled.
Yep.
And so to every listener here who's on this podcast, I think it's worth the question.
Yeah.
Like, how much time do you spend watching TV shows, watching whatever, doing whatever? all of these things are discipling and are shaping you. And we are constantly, always discipling and being discipled.
Yep.
In addition to the process and the programs and all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And so we will be, again, want to fully admit and recognize there are places we can do better and have missed the opportunity to have more places to onboard people and like on-ramps into some formal processes that will be helpful, but they're by no means the ends themselves. I know of one church who has 4 3-month courses you do to kind of get their certificate of, I don't know, they have like a title for it. And so you can either do it all in 1 year straight, or you can do one a year or whatever, and you take them all over the course of time. And I go, that's really great. It's an idea that's awesome. But if you think, got my certificate, I'm a disciple now.
I'm done.
Yeah, like that is so far from the aim. Like there is a lifetime of striving towards becoming more like Jesus that will, even in 100 years, not be enough, not be sufficient in that. Not only by our own limitations, but that also is grounded in a particular context. And so how can I reflect Jesus if I could do it perfectly today? Needs to be adapted to tomorrow's situations. And so there is never enough time to do it perfectly, because things in the world are always changing, and the way that Jesus needs to be revealed is always needing to be relevant to those people. And he's always at work. And so, yes, we can do better, but it's a lifelong journey, as Eugene Peterson stole from, I believe it was Nietzsche. It's a long obedience in the same direction.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that wasn't discipleship he was talking about, was it? Was that holiness? I know that's the name of his book.
But I love the title.
Yes, so do I.
Yeah.
Yes, and to echo what you're saying, we're about to offer soul care.
Yep.
And we already got some people signed up for soul care.
Yep.
And I know Blake loves leading soul care, and he's excited to do it again.
Yep.
He loves, and I'll just put a little plug in, if you're thinking about doing soul care, it is currently December 18th. We're launching
January
the middle
14th.
of January. Yeah, the 14th. It's 9 or 10 weeks.
Do it.
And it is well worth your time.
Yep.
It is incredibly valuable and transformative. And Blake and I have talked about this. The problem comes in when someone goes, I'm done that 8 weeks.
Yeah.
I've cared for my soul.
Yeah.
Like, I'm good. And we have to, what the beauty of the course is it gives you the tools to be able to then care for your soul for the rest of your life. Yeah. And I was having a conversation with someone in our church yesterday who talked about soul care, and they were talking about the value that it had as they continue to embrace and work those tools. And we were talking about the reality of the two mentalities we can go into it with. One is, hey, I got the certificate. Yeah. My soul has been cared for. I'm good. The other is, hey, I've got the tools that I now have some ability to care for my soul that I didn't have before. Yeah. So if you think, I'm going to go to the gym for 8 weeks.
I was going to use the analogy because you just finished your program. We're on a similar program. And yours was 6 weeks for that last
8 weeks.
one? 8 weeks.
Yeah.
You finished the 8 weeks. I'm fit now.
I'm done.
Set.
I'm done. Oreos and pizza for the rest of my life.
Totally, but I'm going to be fit forever because I did those 8 weeks.
Yeah. No, you learn, you grow, and then you move that into the next program, which I started yesterday. And it's that mentality. Nobody's like, I think, to use another, people train for a race.
Yep.
And then the race finishes, and then they stop training.
Yep.
And that's great that you cross that finish line. Nothing wrong with that. Celebrate that. But recognize that's not the end of the journey. Yep. Until we see Jesus face to face, we are still on that journey.
And I believe, and we've gotten into this in other episodes of the podcast, I believe even then that is a starting point to a new way of learning to become more fully human. That I don't think the beginning of eternity is the completion of that process. Like, even then there will be unfolding ways to discover how to glorify God in a perfected creation, or that are eternally going to be unfolding. That's just a new beginning place, not the end. But that's a whole other question. I'm definitely begging for AER there.
Yeah, I actually was just wondering if you were kind of thinking of the Room of Marvels to give a little shout out to January's book club.
No, that was the book club we canceled.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay, then never
Yeah.
mind. That was one for December?
Yep.
Okay,
So
because I
January's
saw
book
someone
club
reading
is,
it, and that's a good book.
it is.
Really good book.
Yeah.
But I was going to... Never mind. I withdraw my plug.
January's book club is You Are What You Love, which is also another excellent book.
That's a very good book.
Yep,
So
there.
I'll plug that
Replug.
one. January's book club. Really good book. There. And I want to come back and I want to end where you started. What is the aim? Because I think it's worth saying again.
Yeah.
The aim of all discipleship is not the gaining of knowledge. It is not anything, like everything that is discipleship serves the ultimate end, which is becoming love, which is being transformed into the image and taking on the character of Jesus and allowing Jesus to be formed in us, that we more joyfully and sacrificially give our lives away in selfless love. That is, if the end of discipleship is not me more happily, regularly, faithfully dying to self,
Yep.
it's not discipleship.
Yep.
That is ultimately the end of all discipleship.
Yep.
Is coming to this place where I'm like, okay, I'm more quick to be able to die to self.
Yeah. Totally.
I've heard definition of discipleship as, moving from unbelief to belief in every area of your life. And I love that one because it does speak to the wide range of how discipleship, sometimes we make it about theological things, and those theological things never cross over into our real life.
Yeah.
I love that definition, but ultimately, that belief that is going to translate into every area of life is, my role in this is to die to self.
Yeah.
That Christ could live through me,
Yeah.
and that the glory of God could be seen.
I'll default back to Dallas Willard's definition of it. Discipleship is the process of becoming who Jesus would be if he were you. How would Jesus spend your money, care for your family, your neighbors, interact with the people around you, love them, all those things.
Which only will happen if you will die to self. Because
Correct.
we think of Jesus' death as like only the thing that he did on the cross.
Yeah.
But Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. And if you don't die to self every day, you can't follow me.
Correct.
So then Jesus is not a hypocrite. So we can't then assume that Jesus is not living this life that he's calling us to. Fully human, modeling that. Before he goes to the cross, he dies to self every day as he, God in the flesh, lives in dependence on and following the leading and the guidance of the Holy Spirit.
Yep.
And you see this just hinted at and shaded in around the edges through the Gospels, this beautiful picture of Jesus not relying on himself because he was God, but Jesus actually living this life that he calls us to. Not once at Golgotha, but every day that ultimately culminates in Golgotha. And so when he got to the garden, I almost said the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, when he prays, Father, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. The reason he can pray that prayer on that night, hours before the cross, is because he's lived a life of praying that prayer and living that out up till that point.
Totally.
And we forget that.
Yep.
We don't realize that Jesus died to himself every day.
Yep.
That's why he said, I only do what I see the Father doing.
Yep.
And that's why he says to his disciples at one point, and I saw this 6 months ago, and I was like, whoa, this is mind-blowing. The words of Jesus. Right? There's this spot in the Gospels, and I could look it up, but I want to keep talking. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
But then he also, in another spot, says, no one knows the Son except the Father. All these people that Jesus has had relationship with, he's speaking to his disciples. Now, I'm sure they'd be like, we know you. But what he's actually saying is, like, I'm living this perfect life of submission, a perfect life of so demonstrating the Father that is more the Father you're seeing than me.
Right.
And it's incredible.
Oh, that's cool. You mean you can still discover new things in the Bible after all these years, Doug?
Even at my advanced age.
The lifelong process of discipleship and learning about God, eh? Yeah. As we've been talking to.
Even at my very, very advanced age.
I didn't put it that way.
I was kind of implying.
I was thinking it.
You can still learn things, Doug? Huh. You can still read? You can still see the words on the page?
I did. You did steal my large print Bible at one point, I think, just to bug you on that, if you're going to go there. But let me ask you the next question, Doug. After thinking about Jesus, taking the time to connect his mother with John and vice versa. This is at the foot of the cross in John's gospel. As mother and son, I wondered why he did it. Mary had other sons, including James, who would end up following Jesus' teachings. But then I wondered whether Jesus knew his family, including his mother, needed the discipleship of someone like John, who could help her see why Jesus had to die. Perhaps it was through this that James came to understand and become a leader.
Absolutely. That could be. We don't know.
No.
John doesn't tell us why Jesus does the thing that he does. Now, John is the one who records this exchange, and so there's a very personal element to John recording that. He's not recording Jesus speaking to Peter like in John 21. He's recording Jesus speaking to him from the cross. And we don't know if John doesn't tell why Jesus said it. Maybe he doesn't know why Jesus says it.
Right.
And this is part of where I think the one of the beauties of, I want to say, the limitation of Scripture, and that might offend people, but I just mean that the Scripture is that's it. Is it's meditative, and that we can take it and we can ponder these things and we can think about. And I think that, yes, this absolutely could be. It's possible Mary didn't have other sons. And if you were coming from a Catholic stream, you wouldn't think she had other sons because you would believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Yep. So James then is not a brother to Jesus, but like a cousin.
Yep.
So there are different thoughts on that. So I want to just recognize that not all of our listeners might have that same perspective.
Yep.
But even if you think she had other sons, this absolutely could very well be. And I applaud and want to just encourage this person who's engaging with Scripture and then thinking about this.
Yeah. I'll just, on the meditative part, point out, I think one of the most profound insights coming from that moment is Jesus expanding the definition of family beyond blood, which was so counter to his day and age. And I think in a lot of ways to ours as well. Like the church is the family beyond blood and allegiance. That it is those who are submitted and at the foot of Jesus and his cross. That is who family is. And so there's just something reflective there that, yes, I think a benefit of John, whether in that moment or over the course of his lifetime, would absolutely be able to help disciple. But that's one of the largest takeaways I grab and gather from that scene.
For me, that scene, what always moves me more than any other part, and I love that. That's a wonderful thought, is Jesus on the cross noticing his mom's pain. Like that is mind-boggling to me. Like there's two other guys who are being crucified at the same time.
Yep.
One on Jesus' right, one on Jesus' left, according to some of the gospel authors.
Yep.
And I would assume, and again, this is me adding to the story what is not written in Scripture. And I recognize and I totally acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Probably those other two guys who were being crucified had family there.
Maybe, yeah.
And would have had, like, there would have been someone who loved them, maybe a spouse, maybe a mother, we don't know, but probably they weren't just nobodies who nobody cared about.
Right.
You're talking about a culture where people didn't move, and there's deep, lifelong connections that most everybody has because it's so radically different than the world we live in now, where people will move to thousands of miles away in pursuit of a career or to marry somebody else or for whatever. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it's a different world.
Yeah.
That to think that there was nobody mourning the loss of the two guys on the other side.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, I'm sure there was.
Right.
And like I just think about if when I'm in a place let's say, I'll use an example. My heel.
Yeah.
I have sometimes like issues with my heel.
Yeah.
And they are extremely painful
Yep.
when they happen. I'm limping around. I do look like I'm 120 years old at that time.
You do.
And it is every step hurts. And when it's really bad, like doing nothing, it's so painful. And the reality is, when I'm in that place, I'm not the most observant person to the cares and concerns of my family.
Yep.
I'll just be honest and I'll just say
Fair.
that. Right? I'm so caught up in myself that I might not notice that something's going on with Laura Lee or that something's happened with Leah. And I miss it.
Of course.
The fact that Jesus sees his mother's grief and like does something to help her.
Yep.
Is mind-blowing to me and just speaks always to me just of how incredibly, beautifully, infinitely perfect the love of God is.
Yep. Awesome.
So I think we should probably call it there. We're
I was
closing
gonna
in
say,
on an
why don't you
hour.
close up while I get behind the cameras?
So that is where we'll leave it hanging. I don't even know what the next question is not going to be a 2-minute question. So we're going to conclude right here, and I thank you for joining us on this verdict of inverted orthodoxy. As always, if you want to submit a question, and Kyle mentioned this earlier, you can go to our website, invertedorthodoxy.com. Click any of the tabs that are on all the pages that say ask a question, and you can do it there. But if you don't care if it's a confidential question or not, you can do that by emailing questions@livingspringsairdrie.com or hello@invertedorthodoxy.com. So those are all the different ways you can submit a question. Some are anonymous. Well, one is anonymous. The others are not. But either way, we will do our best to respond to your question as soon as we get the opportunity. If you could be so kind as to leave us a review and a like, that would be wonderful. But thank you for joining us. We appreciate you being a part of the journey that we go on every week.